Welcome to Stuff You Should Know, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hey, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Josh, and there's Chuck, and Jerry's not here again. She's kind of checked out, frankly. And this is Stuff You Should Know, the Wright Brothers edition, which, frankly, I've been using frankly a lot in the last few seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly is, I think, grew out of our wind tunnel episode. Am I correct in presuming that?
I don't know. I don't remember. I know. I think this is just on a list.
Oh, okay. Whatever.
Sorry. I will say, though, that this, and I know I say this for a lot of episodes, like, why haven't they made a movie? But it is astounding to me that there has not been a big, sweeping 3-hour biopic about the Wright brothers. It's really weird.
Are we still saying biopic?
That's what I say.
That's fine.
You say biopic, right?
Yeah, it just makes sense to me. But so I agree wholeheartedly. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading some research on this is that at one point these guys, like in a test flight, got up like 600 feet in the air. And I was thinking, I want to see what that looked like.
Yeah.
Because these are the first people, some of the first people flying, and they're suddenly 600 feet up in the air. And this was in a glider. This is before it was powered flight. So they were really at the mercy of the wind right then. And I'll bet it was one of the most terrifying things that's ever happened to them. And I thought that would be really something to see. And that's just one of many amazing things that the Wright brothers did. They were amazing human beings.
Yeah, I mean, the story has thrills. It has,
chills.
It has thrills and chills. It's obviously something that changed the course of humanity. Mm-hmm. There are these like very movie-like aha moments that happen along the way. Mm-hmm. It's two guys that were not trained engineers. They were self-taught, brilliant men who figured this out, but they didn't go to school to learn it. So it's just, I don't know. It's got all the right elements, I think. I did find a 29-minute short film from 2012 that's featured Tony Hale.
Oh.
Yeah, the great, Buster Bluth.
Yeah. He was also the dude who rocks out to Mr. Roboto in that classic Volkswagen ad from years back.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. But he plays one of them. I can't remember which one. And I saw a little clip from it. It looked like it was okay. Like it had a decent production value, but
it sounds like a drunk history episode.
I know. It totally does, but it wasn't.
Was he playing it straight, or was it supposed to be tongue-in-cheek?
No, he seemed really drunk, which was weird.
Oh, okay.
No. It was totally straight. I mean, it's hard to imagine him, like the scene that it showed was a very serious scene of him acting, and it was very hard to not laugh a little bit because I think Tony Hale's a brilliant comedic actor. So
sure.
It was kind of tough. I was like, oh man, it seems funny to me still.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out.
But there needs to be a big movie. I want to see this on the big screen. Yeah,
because so again, I mean, you kind of hit on some stuff, but it's really important to point out that the guys who were the first human beings to create, to undertake a powered flight, were the same ones who invented that flying machine that allowed for powered flight, and they were a couple of self-taught amateur bike shop owners who decided that they wanted to be a part of figuring out how to get humans to fly, which was super duper in the zeitgeist at the time. It was like the thing, especially if you were an engineer, that you were probably thinking about. There was a lot of technological razzmatazz going on with things like, the telegraph, which has been around for a while, I guess, but locomotion was a big one. Trains, figuring out how to move humans beyond just foot power or bicycle power.
Or horsepower.
Or horsepower, yeah. That was a big deal. And to get people into the air flying, there were a lot of people working on that. So on one hand, it was also kind of audacious that the Wright brothers would be like, yeah, we'll toss our hat into the ring and see if we can be the ones to figure this out. Just because they were self-taught and they were outsiders as far as the scientific community was concerned.
Yeah, and Dave Roos helped us put this together, and Dave is very keen to point out that like they were outsiders. They weren't trained engineers, but they were far more than guys that just tinkered in a bike shop. They did do that, but they very much, they didn't stumble upon this thing. They very much were very data driven, very rigorous in their experimentation. And it's no surprise that they were the first. They may be unlikely, but not surprising, if that makes sense.
So even at the time, the idea was that it would probably be the French who were the ones that figured out human flight. And even the Wright brothers apparently thought this. But it was still open enough that they decided that they could give it a shot. And they also saw a lot of parallels. You know, they're very famous, as we've said, for owning a bike shop. That was what their trade was in Dayton, Ohio. But they saw a lot of parallels between bicycling and flight. Like, for example, bicycling requires a lot of balance, and you have to figure the same thing out when you're flying. You have to build a machine in the most lightweight way possible that can also convey a human being. Aerodynamics factor into it. So They had a bit of a head start. They weren't coming. It's not like there's nothing in the bicycling world that has anything to do with this, especially if you're an engineer and thinking about things like aerodynamics as far as bicycling is concerned. You can translate that to flight, and that's what the Wright brothers did.
Yeah. I mean, a plane is just a bike with wings, right?
Basically.
Or at least the early ones kind of were.
That's
sort of
what
like a kite and a bike.
My dad's always said that. He
yeah?
says, Junior, if anyone ever asks you what the difference between a bike and a plane is, you tell them nothing.
Then he'd pop some ginseng and go along his way.
That's right.
All right. So the Wright brothers, of course, Wilbur and Orville, they were born to parents, Milton and Susan. They were the third and fourth sons. There were 7 kids total, a pair of twins. A pair of twins? Just 2 people.
Yeah.
I kept wanting to make it 4 people.
A pair of twins.
One single set of twins.
There you go.
Died in infancy. So there were 5 kids that grew into adulthood. And we're going to pepper in some facts about their sister Catherine here and there throughout the episode, because Catherine, I feel like, does not get much credit. And while she was not inventing the aircraft, she was very, very key to their operation and management of these guys throughout their life. And she was a school teacher and then later on a suffragette in Ohio. Yeah,
well, they're I believe their grandfather and probably their father too was big on abolition, and like the whole family kind of had this real defined moral compass that they adhered to rigidly. They also were taught as a family to be maybe a little wary and suspicious of outsiders, and that you found your strength and your trust and your basis in the family. And that actually kind of helps explain Wilbur and Orville's relationship. Neither one of them ever married, and they planned on spending their lives together. That's what they were going to do, and that's what they did until Wilbur died prematurely at age 45. Up until that point, they did spend their lives together, but what I'm saying is they were going to grow old and die together. Mm-hmm. And from the outside, it seems really weird, but when you start to read about them and who they were and how they connected, it's awfully sweet, actually. That they had a great love in their life, and it just happened to be their brother. Not in any kind of weird sexual way, not in any incestuous way. I think the Greeks had
sucks that you even got to say that,
It does. But we're in 2020, man. Don't forget. But I think the Greeks had 4 different kinds of love, and one of them was like a love between 2 men.
Bromance.
Bromance, sure. But this was brothermance, and there was no mance to it. It was just they were brothers that fit together in a way that you rarely see siblings do, and they happen to change the world from that interconnection between them.
Yeah, their mom had a college degree, and she was great at fixing things because her father was a mechanic, and so they got some of the tinkering from her. Their dad was a minister and also ran, I think, the church newspaper, from what I could gather.
Sure.
And like you said, the brothers were tight. They were 4 years apart, but Wilbur wrote this. on paper. I don't know if was it a memoir or was he just writing like a journal?
I don't know. I'm guessing journal. I think they kept journals.
All right. Well, he said this. From the time we were little children, my brother Orville and I lived together, played together, worked together, and in fact thought together. That's thought, not fought. Although they did apparently go at it in a spirited debate kind of way, and they really loved doing that. It wasn't all just like wine and roses. We usually owned all of our toys in common, talked over our thoughts and aspirations, so that nearly everything that was done in our lives has been the result of conversations, suggestions, and discussions between us.
That was a great Katharine Hepburn.
Oh, I could do it as Katharine Hepburn if you want.
Okay, yep. Start over, please.
No. I think there's another quote. I'll do that one later.
Okay, so that just kind of goes to show you like just how connected these guys were just from a very, very young age. And they were 4 years apart. I mean, siblings that are 4 years apart usually don't keep in touch after a certain age, let alone spend their lives together, you know? So it was pretty cool that they had like that kind of connection. And the fact that if you put the two of them together, they were greater than the sum of their parts, basically. Apparently, Orville was once you got to know him, he was a lot of fun to be around. He was, if you had to pick between the two as to who was maybe the more brilliant engineering mind, you probably go with Orville. But that's not to say that Wilbur was any kind of slouch. And of the two, Wilbur was the more outgoing person. Orville was very, very shy. And Wilbur even experienced a pretty big dip in his outgoingness. He had a years-long depression that derailed his college career. He was going to go to Yale, study to become a minister, and do who knows what else. And he was playing hockey one day and I guess took a stick to the face. And I think a couple of other things because he had a long-standing digestion and heart problem after that. But after his face healed, something changed in him, and he went into a years-long funk. And rather than go to college, he directed his energy toward nursing his ailing mom, who was dying of tuberculosis around that time, and spent a few years rather than going to Yale, staying home and just kind of being pretty down in the dumps about things. And luckily, he had Orville around. Orville was also an indefatigable optimist who helped the brothers through some really dark times, and this was one of them.
Yeah, Wilbur didn't even graduate high school because of that, which is remarkable. And also didn't know they had street hockey way back then. Right. So that's something I learned too. But Orville was like even from when he was a kid, he would go door to door collecting bones and selling them as fertilizer to the local fertilizer place. Sure. He built a printing press, and then when he graduated high school, he launched a newspaper, the West Side News, and that's when he got Wilbur sort of out of his depression. He was like, come on, brother, you get on over here. You can be the editor. I'll be the publisher. It was the same year their mother finally did pass away in 1889 of TB. And it seems like that really did kind of save his brother and put them on a renewed shared path together, I think. Yeah. So, shortly after that, I'm not quite sure what year it was, but the bicycle was a big deal. I guess it was 1892. I'm sorry. The bicycle craze was in full swing, and they decided that they would pool their common talents together and open a bike shop in Dayton. And that's what they did. They had a bike shop for a while, for many, many years, even after they were steadily experimenting with human flight. Catherine managed that bike shop, by the way.
This was, so, she was the only one in the entire family to, aside from her parents, to graduate from college. She was the only Wright child. Yeah, I couldn't get a lot. I tried to find out, it's kind of one of those things where when there are 5 kids that live into adulthood and 2 of them are the Wright brothers, you're like, well, what did the other ones do? And there was a lot of good stuff on Catherine and how she assisted them through the years, but I couldn't really find out anything else about the other ones. The other 2 were older brothers, and both of them weirdly became bookkeepers. I don't know why I said it odd the first time, but the first one became estranged from the family, moved to Kansas City. The other one moved to Kansas City, got homesick, and came back to Ohio and then became a bookkeeper.
Right.
And that was
no
it.
shame in that.
They led rather unremarkable, solid lives.
I mean, they didn't invent the airplane, but there's no shame in bookkeeping.
No, they didn't. But Catherine, the fact that she was the only Wright child to graduate from a full 4-year college with a degree, she also did that while she was taking care of the family after her mother died. Like the whole family was like, well, you're the only woman here, so you got to take care of the family. And then she also came back from college. I think she went to Oberlin and became a teacher while she was also taking care of the family too. So she does deserve a lot more credit and kudos than she gets, for sure.
Yes, the C and the K. So let's take a break. Yeah?
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about what's going on there at that bike shop right after this. All right, so the brothers have a bike shop. Catherine's running the thing. They're tinkering around in there. The world, previous to this bike shop opening in 1892, like you said, there were electric trolleys going around, and Carl Benz had built the first real good automobile. And these guys were, they liked their bike shop. It was doing great. But Wilbur was like, you know what? I see what's going on in France, and I think that we can do this, brother. Like, who cares that we're not college educated? Who cares that I didn't even finish high school? And who cares that we're just bike shop owners in Dayton? I think we can invent a powered airplane. They didn't even call them airplanes at the time, a powered flyer. And so he wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in D.C. and said, should I read it as Catherine Hepburn?
Yes, please.
And said, I believe that simple flight is at least as possible to man. I am an enthusiast, but not a crank. I wish to avail myself of all that is already known and then, if possible, add my bit, you old poop.
That was a great Truman Capote.
It was. And I think that'll probably never happen again. I think there's one more quote, but that should be Sammy Davis Jr.
No, do the third quote as Truman Capote then. Just keep building on it like that.
All right. Okay. So the long and short of it is the secretary of the Smithsonian, a man named Samuel Langley, got this letter. He was a man who was receiving a lot of government grants to work on powered flight.
Yeah, it was huge. Everybody was working on it at the time.
Everyone was. And he was failing at it. He had something called the Aerodome, which by the time the Wright brothers got cranking up, had already failed.
Yeah. Luckily, he wasn't one of those egotistical guys who controls the purse strings. He said, all right, well, if you need some information.
Yeah.
Here's a bunch of information, and he sent them everything that they had. Yeah, he sent them basically a reading list and a bunch of journals that they should subscribe to and start investigating, and really kind of help them get along their way. This was also a time when some early flyers were approaching this scientifically and publishing their data, not the least of which was a guy named Otto Lilienthal. And we must have talked about him in the Wind Tunnel episode too, because he definitely was an inspiration who actually died during one of his test flights.
Yeah.
And on his tombstone, it says sacrifices must be made, which are his purported last words, which is controversial. He probably actually didn't say that, but that's what is on his tombstone. But he left a bunch of tables. So they started studying Otto Lilienthal's flight test data. They were subscribing to journals, reading books, just they were reading everything they could about the mechanics of flight and birds and just trying to figure this out. And they basically, through this approach, through just basically absorbing the data and the theories that were already out there, they figured out, okay, we seem to understand how to get this stuff in the air and keep it up in the air. We've got lift and drag figured out. We have power sources generally figured out. What seems to be the big challenge is controlling the plane when it's in the air.
Yeah.
Because that's what got Otto Lilienthal, this thing where you start to turn, and then all of a sudden the flying craft turns back the original direction, and it causes it to stall. So you no longer have any lift, and you just fall out of the air like a sack of potatoes. That had to do with controlling the plane. So the Wright brothers identified very quickly and early on that was a good thing to concentrate on. And that's what they started with, was figuring out how to control the plane in the air.
Yeah, because as we'll see later on when we get to France, they could fly straight, they could fly in a circle, but they couldn't control straight and circle at the same time and fly where they wanted to fly, which is a big key in an airplane, is you want to actually go someplace, not just whatever's straight ahead of you.
Exactly.
So they said, well, here's, the big challenge was the fact that, and we've talked about this on a few of our different episodes over the year about plane flight. But there's three things you got to do when you're up there. Is you got to control your pitch, which is your nose up and your nose down.
Sure.
Your roll, which is your wing tips going, up or down and turning you.
And then what?
And then you got that yaw control. One of the best Simpsons jokes ever.
Look at that yaw control.
And that is nose right or nose left. And it's those three things, those three different axes, controlling them all at the same time stumped everybody.
Yes, because the flying contraptions that were being built were basically gliders. They were basically hang gliders.
Yeah, exactly.
That people were building, which was a big first step that we needed to figure out, because with a hang glider, you can figure out the shape, the size, the curvature, the angle of the wing. And when the Wright brothers came into this field, when they decided to cast their lot and to figure out how to fly, basically people had thought they had already figured out the wing. But that one thing about saying, like, controlling the wing to moving from one side to the other without stalling out, like I said, they kind of studied the mechanics of birds, and one of them noticed, I guess it was Wilbur, noticed that when a bird banks, the actual shape of its wing changes, so that when the wing twists a certain way, it causes air to go above it, to build up above it, or below it, which means that you're going to turn one way or the other depending on which way your wing is curved. And he said, hey, if we could figure out how to make our wings do that, that might really work. But how, Chuck? Yeah,
so here's the sort of movie, one of the aha moments, and hopefully it happened like this. This is a great story if it wasn't, but he was in his bike shop. He sold a dude an inner tube and was holding the empty box when the guy left. And he said, by Zeus's beard, this looks like two parallel wings of a biplane. And when I twist this thing just right, the right wing tips curve down and the left wing tip curves up on this box. And he was like, I think I've just stumbled upon the way to do this, except we're going to do it initially with what was basically sort of like a glorified box kite. We're going to do it with wires running through the wings that you can twist and warp these things from the ground, which was a big deal. They were doing this in Dayton. People would walk by and they're like, man, that is one crazy kite. I've never seen a kite do this kind of stuff.
Oh, I think you should do that in Sammy Davis.
That is one crazy kite, babe.
Very nice.
So, so they were in Dayton still at this point, flying this box kite around, and they were starting to get the hang of bending these wings to their will to make it do stuff.
Yeah, that's what humans do.
I love this, Sammy.
Man, it has changed not just the podcast, but my life, frankly, for the better.
Oh, boy.
So, yeah, they start testing out as kites, which is pretty sensible because, the goal ultimately is to get a human in there and then to power the whole thing. But, you want to make sure that the thing's not going to crash or stall out or whatever. So they would do they would build these gliders and then basically control them like kites before they got in there very sensibly, which I think is a pretty smart move.
Yeah, they just started building them bigger, basically. Like each one was a little bit bigger than the one before.
Right, and then once they would see, like, okay, yeah, this principle actually works, then they would start to get into the glider. They would convert the kite to a glider and then try themselves with them in there. So they again, the purpose was to get a person aloft It's supposed to be human flight. But they realized that to get a human in the air, you needed a really, really big glider, or you needed a really good, strong headwind. And they didn't have the money or the resources to build a really, really big glider of the size that it would have taken to just fly it around Dayton. So they started looking for places that have really high winds. And I mean, if this is going to be turned into a really good movie, there's going to be like letter writing scenes, because they did a lot of letter writing, and it actually like moves the story forward quite frequently.
Oh,
and
totally.
This is one of those cases. They wrote to the National Weather Service or the U.S. Weather Bureau, and they said, "Hey, do you have any wind data around the United States?" And they said, "By Zeus's beard, we do. We have reams of that stuff." And they sent them the September and August, I believe, weather data for the United States, all the weather stations across the United States, and they started poring over the data looking for reliable, strong winds, and they found several.
Yeah, what they wanted, though, was they wanted to kind of work in private. So they said, who has a lot of wind and not many people around? And where they landed, quite literally, was Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And this is at the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which now is sort of a different place. I mean, it's still, it's not like Daytona Beach or anything, but back then there was like not much of anything there. It had really good wind.
Yeah.
It had sandy dunes that if you did crash this thing, it wouldn't be as bad as crashing like in a hard field and like a frosty field in Dayton, Ohio. And so they said, this is the place. Let's go down to Kitty Hawk. They did so in 1900 with a 17-foot wingspan glider. They had that same wire technology to bend these wings like the box kite.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get it off the ground with a passenger, so it couldn't be a glider. And they said, we still got to treat this thing as a kite, basically.
Yeah, they went back to the drawing board. They couldn't figure out what the problem was. And they realized that there might have been something wrong with the wing, so they started kind of pouring themselves into the wing a little more. They figured out that maybe the curvature of the top of the wing needed to be taller and closer to the front. And they came up with another glider, the 1901 glider, which had a 22-foot wingspan, and went back to Kitty Hawk. And this time they did manage to get in the air. They took this glider for a flight, but just like with Otto Lilienthal, it stalled out with Wilbur on it, and it crashed to the ground. He cracked his head open on a strut, a wing strut, I believe, and could have died. He was very lucky he didn't die, but he didn't. And they said, okay, well, back to the drawing board. We've got to figure this out. And they figured something out that I think probably pushed them along. What they were doing wasn't wrong. They were following data that was wrong.
From the guy who died.
From Otto Lilienthal.
That should have been their first clue.
They figured out that his data wasn't particularly reliable, or it was just plain old incorrect, and that there's also something called Smeaton's coefficient, which was the value for air density that you would use when you're figuring out things like drag or lift. And they went back to the drawing board and said, we are going to have to conduct our own experiments and create our own tables.
Yep.
And this is when they built their very famous, now, thanks to our episode on wind tunnels, wind tunnel.
That's right. They, like we said, there were wind tunnels around, but they had one themselves. I think it was about 6 feet long. And they built 200 little model wing designs because, we've said it before, but it bears in mind repeating that they're working with these wings are stacked, so it's not just like it's not a. Why is that funny?
Forget it.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Okay.
It's not just a single wing coming out each side. It's like a biplane or a box kite. So you've got four different. Well, not four different. It's really two different things you're trying to figure out. But you've got four wings, and they had to carve these things to. They had like, what if the top wing is a little bit different and the bottom wing is a little bit different. Right. So it's a lot of experimentation that went into this.
Yeah.
And they built 200 model wings and tested them in that little wooden wind tunnel. And the real key, though, was that they had equipment that could very accurately measure that lift and drag, and they could really kind of stack everything out head to head and see which one worked the best.
Yeah.
Which combination, rather.
Yeah, they built what are called balances, which measure the movement of the, say, like the wing or the movement of the air around the wing. We talked a lot about that in the wind tunnel episode, but I didn't realize that engineers basically consider that the balances that they created to be on par, if not exceeding, the impressiveness of the fact that they achieved flight. Like these balances were not so precise, and they built them out of old bike spokes and hacksaw blades.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things they were well known for, was they could say, oh yeah, a hacksaw blade, what could I use this for? And they would just fit it into different scenarios in their mind and say, oh, I could do this. Or I need to build this, what could I use for this? And they would come up with hacksaw blades and bike spokes. And then more impressive than that, these things would actually work. So thanks to their dedication to experimentation and taking down data and then building these balances that gave them very, very accurate data, they not only were able to build their own tables to figure out which wing shape and form and size was going to produce the best lift and the best control, they also were able to revise Smeaton's coefficient, which had been in use since the 18th century, from 0.05 to 0.0033. And if you do the math today using modern equipment, it was almost exactly precise. And they figured it out thanks to their hacksaws and bike spokes.
That's right. And Jimmy Smeaton sat up in his grave, burped out a little dust bubble,
right,
and then laid back down.
I don't feel like it today.
So they have their own data now. They go back to Kitty Hawk in 1902, well-armed, feeling good. They get their third glider going based on this data, and it worked. It could carry a person, and they had this, sliding effect that caused Wilbur to crash in that last flight. So they added a rudder to stabilize things during turns. And they made thousands of test flights with this glider over the course of like 1902 and 1903. A couple of times they went over 600 feet, like you said earlier, in altitude in a glider. And they said, and I think this is a great time for a break, they said, I tell you what's next. We got to power this thing with an engine, or we're just gliding around like a bird.
Yep.
So we'll be back right after this to talk about their power source.
Okay, Chuck. So they have the shape, the size, the design of the actual flying machine, but unless they power it, it's just gliding, basically. And they knew that gliding wasn't going to cut it. What's more, it's worth pointing out, Chuck, that they had already contributed to aeronautics and our understanding of aerodynamics to an astounding degree. That the data sets that they came up with from their wind tunnel was the greatest, most advanced set of data any scientist on planet Earth had at the time. And again, these are the self-taught Wright brothers working in their bicycle shop who are doing this. But they said that's not enough. We're really close. We think we can figure this out. We are going to invent the airplane, basically. And that's what they set about doing.
Yeah. So, and I still can't imagine, dude, being 600 feet up. The poop your pants feeling that must have been.
Yeah. You know who could do it really well? I see Sam Rockwell.
Oh, yeah.
It's either Orville or Wilbur. Maybe Orville.
Both.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He'd be like Tom Hardy in Legend.
Yeah. You just change him up. He wouldn't be twins, but he could play both parts. That'd be kind of cool.
Sure.
You only got to pay one guy.
That's right. But you have to pay him twice.
So they go back to Dayton. They decided they were trying to figure out how to power this thing, and they said, well, if we're going to power this, we need to figure out the engine and the propeller. And they thought about the Navy. They were like, the Navy builds plenty of propellers for their boats. And they were very surprised to learn that in all those years, that the Navy never really worked on thrust and the design of a propeller. Mm-hmm. So they said thrust is the key here. So we're going to go back here and we're going to carve dozens and hundreds of little tiny propellers by hand from little tiny pieces of wood.
I'll bet you love that, don't you? Miniatures.
Oh my God, I love it. And I try to carve something every time I go camping. And in 35 years, I've never carved anything that was worth keeping.
What do you have like a go-to like fertility idol or a knife?
I used to try and carve like tobacco pipes and then just little people, and I was just never any good at whittling and stuff. But
How would you get the hole through the pipe?
That was the problem.
Sure. So you got the pipe, it was just not functioning.
Well, I would have to then take it home and like use a drill or something, but it never made it. They always just ended up in the fire.
I got you. Okay.
But
go back to where you came from, you stupid pipe.
So they're carving these little propellers, and and Dave points out too that they may have been the first engineers ever to come to the realization that the same forces that generate lift in an airplane in a curved wing, which is Bernoulli's principle, was the same force that worked with a propeller, and that a propeller was essentially just a wing that's vertical and spins.
Yeah, they figured out that there's a direct correlation between lift and thrust, and it just has to do with whether the wing is horizontal or vertical. And the idea that they were the first ones to figure this out is just mind-boggling to me, but they seem to be. And at the very least, even if they weren't the first ones to figure it out, they were the ones who figured out how to build a propeller blade such that it did produce thrust. So they figured out how to get this thing to be more than a glider by propellers moving and pushing the plane through the air, propelling it, you could say. But they had to figure out how to power the propellers. And that was a big, big problem, because at the time, the thing that had held people back for a very long time was steam technology was basically all you had.
Yeah.
And you just were not you were not getting off of the ground with a steam engine. So the Wright brothers apparently wrote a bunch of letters to a bunch of different engine making companies and said, here are our parameters or design parameters. Can you fulfill these? And they couldn't. Not a single company came back and said, we can do this. Although apparently a couple did, but said we could do this for, a king's ransom.
Yeah.
And they're like, we can't afford that. So the Wright brothers, being the Wright brothers, just said, we'll just do this ourselves.
Yeah. We'll go back to that bike shop. And they had a guy working there named Charlie Taylor, who was a machinist. And he was, it just sounds like another one of these guys that was just really good at figuring stuff out.
In the movie, Charlie and Catherine would be romantic interests of one another. It'd be super cute.
Oh, well, there's actually a sad story later that involves that. But
will it make the story even better,
we'll save
though?
that for the end.
Okay.
Let's say they just had a brief fling, and maybe she inspired him to tinker better.
Okay.
Does it work that way?
Sure, it can. Why not?
Or maybe she gives him the brilliant idea during some hot coitus.
I guess. I was thinking maybe like a rowboat ride on the lake, but sure, coitus. I guess you could have coitus in the rowboat on the lake.
We should just abandon this.
All right.
So Charlie builds
Hey, 6th grade classes, by the way.
Oh, I know. We should probably take all that out.
Okay.
So Charlie builds a 4-cylinder engine out of aluminum, and no one had ever used aluminum before in aircraft construction. So this was yet another thing that the Wright brothers and Charlie Taylor came up with that would ended up revolutionizing aviation. It became the backbone of aviation.
Right.
Was using this lightweight aluminum, super strong, super light, and they connected this thing to the propeller using bicycle chains.
Yeah, and if they weren't showing off before, they were by then, because the engine they created, they figured out they needed a minimum of 8 horsepower, and the engine they created was 12 horsepower. So it had more than enough to power the propellers, which would produce thrust, which would actually create powered flight. And those bike chains were pretty ingenious too, because there were 2 sets of gears, one on each side going toward each propeller, and those bike chains connected the propeller to the engine, but to keep the propellers from shooting I guess it would be yaw out the yin-yang, from creating a gyroscope with the 2 propellers going the same way, they decided to have the propellers go in the opposite direction of one another. To make that happen, they just turned one of the bike chains into a figure 8. How ingenious is that?
Yeah, going in opposite ways, kind of like, I don't know, like you see on airplanes these days.
Exactly. So the Wright brothers figured that out too. So now all of a sudden they put all this stuff together. They put together some controls because remember, controls were like one of the big, that was one of the big challenges. They figured out a whole set of controls that controlled the rudder, that controlled these elevators in the front of the airplane that kept the nose from diving or lifting too much. And then they had the little lever that warped the wing one way or another to let you bank. And so they could control pitch, roll, and yaw on a engine-powered aircraft with dual propellers, and they were ready to go. All
right, so here's how this thing is actually flown, which is pretty interesting because, like you said before, they were figuring out, like the biggest trick was how to figure out how to control this thing so you could make it go where you wanted it to go. And no one had really done this effectively yet. So it sort of operated like you said, like a hang glider, and that the pilot is laying down on his stomach in the middle of the plane. You've got the engine on the right, and then right in front of the pilot was what was known as the elevator, which are two little stacked wings that could be adjusted. And you adjust them with a little wooden lever in the left hand of the pilot to control the pitch, and that is nose up or down.
Right. And those apparently used to go in the back of the plane, and Otto Lilienthal crashed with the elevators in the back, so the Wright brothers were the ones that moved them to the front, which helped quite a bit. That was a big one. There was also the hip cradle.
Yeah, that side to side.
Yeah, it was like using your hips to steer the plane, basically. And so the hip cradle that you laid in was connected to wires that pulled on the wings that caused them to warp one way or another. And then it also was connected to the rudder so that would stabilize yaw as well. So you had two different mechanisms that controlled those three different axes.
It's very ingenious.
All of a sudden, it really is super ingenious. Now all of a sudden you have a plane that's under human control.
Right. Like they couldn't figure out at this point a joystick that could control all those things at once. So that hip cradle was, I think, pretty smart. To take off, like this is the one thing I actually never knew. I always wondered, how did they, like surely they didn't have that engine powerful enough to get them going and take off. And that is correct. They actually had to get up in the air for those 12 horses to do their work. And to do that, they slid this thing on a dolly, on a 60-foot rail, basically, by the hub of a bicycle wheel. So they get it going on this dolly, and then it launches, and then that's when the engine has enough of a head start with the thrust to get it going in the air.
Yeah, so when the thing kind of launched off of the rail, it was in glider mode a little bit. That helped the engine kick in or take over, get enough power.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine they had the engine going, though, don't you think?
No, they totally did. But like you were saying, it wasn't enough to just go from a standstill. Yeah. They needed that glide to get it started.
Right.
So on December 17th at 10:35 a.m., actually there was an unsung test flight that doesn't get a lot of praise. But on December 14th, they tried their first attempt in this powered flyer. And they tossed a coin to see who would go, and Wilbur won. And it went down the track and went off of the track and crashed immediately and broke the elevators. So they took 3 days to repair the elevators, and on the next try, on December 17th, it was Orville's turn. And so he became the first human to fly in a powered flight. Orville Wright did. He flew for 12 seconds, just a few feet, I believe. I think it was about 120 feet. But it was controlled. He landed it, and it was a genuine powered flight. And from that first flight, I think even from the one that Wilbur tried 3 days before, they were like, "This is going to work."
Yeah.
I can tell from the way the controls responded, and like, this is going to work. We just gotta keep trying. So they did.
Yeah. So on that same day, they did 3 more flights. And the longest one, Wilbur, I love that they were taking turns. I think that's so cool.
Yeah.
Wilbur piloted 852 feet in about a minute in the air, which is remarkable. Like, this is the moment of the movie, where everyone is just going crazy. It's like the high point of the film. And then they go in, and just like a movie, they go inside, they're having a cocktail, they're warming up, and they're so happy. And a big gust of wind comes in and lifts this thing off the ground and smashes it and breaks it into pieces. Mm-hmm. Oh, man. Can you imagine?
Yeah, so, I can't imagine seeing that. You'd just be like, oh, look, the thing's being lifted into the air. Look at it. Oh, God, no.
They're like, it's tied down. And then Sam Rockwell goes to Sam Rockwell, yeah, but crash.
Right, yeah. That's the problem. So they apparently were not particularly worried about this at this point because they'd already shown multiple times that this proof of concept was it would work.
Yeah.
That they had undertaken the first flight. They'd done it basically. So they went back to Dayton. They had a habit of leaving their test flyers at Kitty Hawk because they'd beat them up so badly that it wasn't worth moving them back. And some of them are preserved, and I believe that first flyer that they created is in one of the Air and Space Museums. Maybe in Dayton. I'm not sure. It would make sense if it was.
I've seen that somewhere.
It might be at the one out by Dulles.
Maybe, or maybe I've just seen a replica. I feel like I've seen one in an airport and not a museum, so that was definitely a replica.
Gotcha.
And it was actually only 6 inches wide,
right.
And a kid was flying it around.
Sure. It was RC controlled.
Yeah, come to think of it, I've got this all wrong.
So the Wright brothers, they released a press release. Like they were acutely aware of, what they'd just done. This wasn't something they had fallen backwards into. This wasn't something that, just happened through sheer luck. Like they worked their way to powered flight. So they let the world know about it, and they got zero response in return, basically.
Yeah, this was pretty disappointing. I think they, they sent out this press release, like you said, and got nothing. And I think they were like, hey, everyone, we flew a plane, right. Like this thing that everyone's trying to do all over the world. We did it. Hi. And it seems to be just a case of, like Dave says, the boy who cried wolf, like these newspaper editors had been burned by writing about other people who said they'd done it. And they're like, yeah, right. And it took, this is kind of one of the greatest parts of the story, I think. In September 1904, a journalist that was writing a beekeeping journal called Gleanings in Bee Culture, Mr. I.A. Root, was the first person to actually say, yeah, I'll write about this thing. That sounds like a good story. Gleanings in Bee Culture.
Who would play him?
John C. Reilly, I think.
Oh yeah, good call, man. Okay, so John C. Reilly shows up. He had read about the Wrights, and he said, "Can I see one of your flights?" And they invited him out, and he wrote about it, and it didn't get much attention at the time because I don't think Gleanings in Bee Culture had a really huge readership.
It was a glowing story, though.
I think you should read this quote in whatever accent you want to read.
No, I'm just going to read it regular.
Okay.
God in his great mercy has permitted me to be at least somewhat instrumental in ushering in and introducing to the great wide world an invention that may outrank the electric cars, the automobiles, and all other methods of travel, and one which may fairly take a place beside the telephone and wireless telegraphy. Am I claiming a good deal? Well, I will tell you my story, and you shall be the judge.
So that was pretty good. I mean, for no accent whatsoever.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the actual article.
So, they still didn't get any kind of attention from that, but it is a pretty great little footnote to the whole thing that was the first article that was written on them.
Yeah.
Gleanings in Bee Culture.
They even wrote the War Department and said, hey, we invented an airplane. Do you want to buy it? And they said, nah.
Yeah, one of the reasons why was because the War Department was like, well, can you send us the specifications? The Wright brothers were like, no.
Yeah.
We invented this. And you give us a contract first and then we'll give you the specifications. And the War Department said no. even worse than the fact that they weren't getting any kind of credit for their accomplishment and no takers on selling their design was that over in France, remember we said that even the Wright brothers thought that the French would be the first to a powered flight. The French were convinced that they would be the first to the powered flight and that they had cracked it. There was a Brazilian balloonist named Alberto Santos Dumont. I think they made a movie about him recently. He's a super colorful character, right?
I don't know.
I believe they did. He gave a demonstration in Paris.
A movie? And the Wright brothers
got a movie. Yeah. I feel like they just called it Dumont with an exclamation point, maybe.
Huh.
But he flew a plane in Paris, I believe, of his own design, and it just flew in a straight line, no control. But it was enough at the time because, again, no one was paying attention to the Wright brothers. It was enough for the French to be like, "Sacre bleu!" This flight has been achieved, and the Wright brothers are like, "No, this doesn't. No, what we're doing is so much better than this." 1908, there was a Frenchman named Henri Farman, who was the first to fly a powered plane in a 1 kilometer closed circle. This is 1908. It bears mentioning that the Wright brothers, who again, they're total outsiders, no one's listening to them. 3 years previous to this, they had stopped the experimental stage. They had reached the point where they had produced a reliable plane. And by 1905, 3 years before this French pilot did that 1 kilometer closed circle flight that just knocked the socks off of the French, they had done a 24.5-mile circle in 39 minutes. The Wright brothers had 3 years before this. And so imagine accomplishing this and then seeing people doing like preschooler stuff compared to what you're doing, getting all of this praise and attention and press lavished on them, and no one's listening to you. This is the situation that the Wright brothers found themselves in at the time.
Okay, so Wilbur has had enough. He goes to France in 1908 on August 8th, and he said, you know what? I'm going to go demonstrate this thing. I'm going to show them that flying straight is stupid, and I'm going to show them that we can actually make this thing turn and do whatever we want. And so he went to a little small racetrack outside of Le Mans and got on the ground and said, "Gentlemen, I am going to fly." And they all spoke French, and they were like, I don't know what he said, but
he said something.
I think he's about to do something big. So he flew, and if the French were like sacre bleu at that one flight, they were really knocked out at this one. They all realized that what was going on in front of their eyeballs was something that the French had never accomplished, that no one had ever accomplished before, and that they were basically done. And there was a Frenchman, supposedly, that was there that was quoted in the newspapers by saying, "Nous sommes battus." We are beaten.
Yeah. So, I mean, imagine being like the French at the time and seeing somebody in a hang glider with a bicycle gear on it and being like, people are flying. And then somebody shows up in like a Piper Cub and is like, watch this. That was kind of the level of knock your socks off that the French saw. And that was it. Like from that point on, the Wright brothers were overnight sensations. They were the first superstars of the 20th century for being the first to fly. And they finally started to get their acclaim.
So, yeah, these guys are superstars. Catherine is actually, if you remember, we haven't talked about her in a bit. She's actually a superstar, too, because she goes with them. She learns French for the express purpose of helping the brothers out while they go on an eventual European tour. She negotiates a deal with – because these guys, I get the sense that neither one of them were businessmen, and they really sort of had their head in the invention game. And so Catherine was really key for – initially managing that bike shop and then helping them out with their journaling and data keeping. And then she's the one that actually negotiated with the Army. Because, the Army said, hey, we'll give you guys some money. We'll give you guys $25,000 as a grant, but you got to be able to fly a pilot and a passenger. And I presumably, a couple of bombs or something and a gun maybe.
Sure.
Would be my guess.
Or at the very least, a guy with a rifle on the side.
Yeah, something on the hip.
Was this before or after the tragic game of hide and seek with Catherine and Charlie Taylor where he hid in the trunk and got locked in and suffocated to death that you referenced earlier?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay, but it was around that time from what I understand, right?
I think so. So Catherine, she negotiates this money, and Wilbur is in France, and Orville at this time goes back to D.C., and he eventually in D.C. does a flight that goes for 70 minutes.
Yeah, so the French, when they saw this, the French government was like, take our money. How much do you want for this plane? And they started to negotiate with France to sell their military planes. That got the attention of the U.S. War Department finally. Said, okay, we're on board. We'll start buying planes from you too. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about the Wrights is that they spent several years around this time training the militaries of the U.S. and Europe how to fly planes and selling them planes.
They were the first flight instructors.
Yeah, they really were. So during one of these training, I guess, kind of demonstrations, Orville had a passenger named Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. And they went up and were circling a field, and I'm not quite sure what malfunction they had. Do you know what it was?
No, I just know that Orville had to cut the engine basically and try and land.
He was going to try to glide in. Yeah. And it didn't go very well. The plane, I guess, lost its lift and just fell out of the sky again, which was a real problem back in those days. And Orville broke some ribs. He sprained his back, but Thomas Selfridge died. He fractured his skull. He became the first casualty of a powered airplane crash in the history of humanity, which is kind of a dubious honor, really.
Yeah, it was. Orville recovered, of course. He came to France, and this is when Catherine also came to France, and this is where they did their big sort of a victory tour where they were demonstrating this thing all over Europe. People loved it. It was huge. And like you said earlier, Wilbur and Orville and Catherine were the first big celebrities of the 20th century. It's pretty astounding.
And Orville was like, where's Charlie Taylor? And Catherine was like, I don't know. I haven't seen him in like a year now. He just kind of dropped off the face of the earth.
So strange.
So when their company became established, the Wright Company to design and build planes, when that got off the ground, sorry, everybody, Orville was kind of dedicated to the actual production and invention side, while Wilbur dedicated himself to the business side, meaning he ran around suing anybody he thought was infringing on their patents. And he spent a lot of time doing that. Again, remember, they were kind of raised not to trust outsiders like they trusted their family, which is the opposite of the stuff you should know motto.
Right.
And on some trip, while he was, I believe, filing one of these patent infringements or investigating it, he died after a trip to Boston. He caught typhoid. And I looked, and Typhoid Mary was not cooking at the time. She was on hiatus.
Not her fault.
Because I thought, wouldn't that just be amazing if he caught typhoid from Typhoid Mary? But he did not, or as far as I could find, he did not. So he went back home to Dayton and he died, and he was only 45, actually. And remember, Orville and Wilbur planned to spend the rest of their lives together. So this had a pretty big effect on Orville.
Yeah, I get the sense, and this is where I sort of hinted earlier about Catherine and her romance. Mm-hmm. She went with him and kind of stayed with Orville. He didn't have much interest in running the Wright Company anymore. So he sold it in 1915, sold all their patents for $1 million, about $26 million today. So a huge sum of money to, retire for the rest of your life.
Sure.
And that's what he did. He still did stuff. This was at Hawthorne Hill, his big mansion in Dayton. He built an automatic toaster that sliced the bread. He built a system of chains that let him adjust the furnace from upstairs. He built a circular shower. He was never going to stop building things, but it was all, I got the sense, in just sort of retirement hobby sort of way.
Yeah.
But Catherine, the sad ending there is she met a man and fell in love. I can't remember his name, and decided to get married, and was really nervous about Orville. I think he was so dependent on her being around that she rightfully was scared, and she was correct. And he refused to speak to her ever again after she got engaged and got married.
Oh, wow. Which
is really kind of cruddy. That's the nicest way to say it. And it made me kind of think ill of him at the end. Mm-hmm. And she got pneumonia and was dying, basically. He still wouldn't talk to her. And finally, one of his friends said, you got to go talk to Catherine, man. This is your sister. And apparently he did arrive at her deathbed at least. But
she had died.
Yeah. Well, I think he got there first, but she did pass away of pneumonia. And it's just a very sad ending to her story of after not getting much credit over the years and sort of being at the beck and call of these brothers that were brilliant inventors and being a key part of their team. And then being too scared to tell her brother that she had fallen in love and gotten married. It was really sad.
That is very sad. So Orville outlived her as well, huh? I hadn't realized that. Well, he kept, like you said, tinkering kind of in retirement as a consummate inventor for the rest of his life. And he actually died, he suffered a heart attack while fixing a doorbell and then died 3 days later. Yeah. Apparently super alone. I didn't realize that. That was a real bummer ending that I hadn't anticipated, Chuck. Yeah,
it's a double bummer.
I thought we were going to end it kind of like him being like, I invented to the end. And then, the Sousa band starts playing.
I got mad at my sister because she found love and I never did.
Yeah. Or he did find love and it was his brother who died years before.
Yeah, perhaps.
So that's it for the Wright brothers, huh?
That's it.
Evel Knievel got a 2-parter and the Wright brothers didn't.
Yeah, well, he broke more bones.
We're never going to live that down.
Nope.
I'm never going to let us live that down. You got anything else?
Nothing.
Did I say that already?
Maybe.
Okay. Either way, it's time for listener mail.
I'm going to call this from a 10-year-old fan. We love hearing from our young listeners.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. My name is Quinn, and I'm 10 years old and from Vancouver, BC. I really enjoy listening to your podcast on my way to school. The 2 most interesting podcasts that I've listened to so far is the one about soap. It's really cool how soap is made. And the second one about porcupines. It's so cool that the old world porcupines have straight quills. Now the new world porcupines have barbed quills and how they're harder to get out of your body. I am very interested in the Titanic and the story behind it. And I was wondering if you guys ever thought of doing a podcast on the Titanic.
Totally.
Yeah, we totally should. If you have, it's a very interesting topic to listen to. So if you've thought about doing that, then maybe you could do it. It would give me something to look forward to on the car ride to school. I really hope you read this email, and I'm also hoping that you can write back if you have time. You guys keep up the good work, and please keep making podcasts for me to listen to. All caps, thank you so much. Sincerely, Quinn.
That was a great email, Quinn. Thanks a lot for it.
It's great. And that cute thing happens to where it's from the parents' email, which is always one of my favorite things. So I wrote back to Quinn's, I think, dad, and said to tell Quinn that this is going to be a listener mail.
So, Quinn, we've been wanting to do a Titanic episode for a while, but there was a period there where everyone had seen Titanic so recently, the movie, that it was like, why would you even bother to do an episode on it right now? Everybody'd be like,
now.
That's not what James Cameron says.
Yeah.
Now we can do one, and it's high time.
So.
I've wanted to since day one. So listen out for a Titanic episode and know that came from you there, Quinn.
Yeah, that'll be a 2-parter probably.
We'll see. Only time will tell. If we mention Evel Knievel in it, then yes, it probably will be.
Right.
If you want to get in touch with us like Quinn did, we are always on the lookout for emails from you. You can send it to us at stuffpodcast@iheartradio.com.
Stuff You Should Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.